www.panelists.org/CRSJ to find out what else we have going on. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A rather than the chat. The chat gets really messy really quick, and the Q&A has more functionality, so please use that. If you don't see those controls, it's probably because the screen has gone idle. So just sort of refresh your screen. We'll address the questions at the end of the panel, but feel free to ask your questions while it's happening. And we'll sort of manage them in the background and then serve them up to our lovely panelists. We are sharing a recording of this program to everyone who's attended, and it's also free. So please do share it with your colleagues' network. And our impressive panelists today cover an incredible gamut of issues, which those of you familiar with environmental justice know is just par for the course with EJ. And the prominence of the interplay between race and environment is more now than we've ever seen, I think. And so it's a very powerful panel coming together to speak about the different environments and the different communities that are being affected by climate and various other environmental aspects. So for our incarcerated populations, people affected by extreme weather events or man-made disasters, like we've seen in Flint, or from the various leaking oil and gas pipelines across the country, especially on tribal lands, and how communities on the front lines have been working with attorneys and activists to bring about real change. And whether it's in stopping a pipeline, dangerous pipeline project, or holding a corporate polluter accountable in the courtroom or in the court of public opinion, or in developing things like educational programs for children who suffered from lead poisoning. So our incredible panel will explore these topics and the overlaps between race and the environment and climate. And I encourage everyone to check out the websites and the programs of everyone here, because there's so much more to go deeper on. And we're only going to touch on, sort of the surface of many various issues. So I really encourage everyone to follow up on everyone's various groups. So leading us off today is a good friend of mine and a colleague, Nadia Ahmad, Associate Professor of Law at Barry University's School of Law and a council member at the ABA's section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and my illustrious co-chair at the Environmental Justice Committee. And so I welcome her to lead us off today.
Thank you, Scott. What we wanted to do today here at the ABA is to start off Black History Month with the importance of the movement that started this this moment that we are at right now, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement. And we are here as a part of the ABA to show commitment to this movement and to show that the rule of law, as well as the systems of law and how they have existed in the past, are no longer tolerable and acceptable. And that to see the change that we want and believe in, we really have to make the changes and create the systems in which we can have a world where Black Lives Matter. And so the presentation that I want to do today is part of a larger project that we had done at the ABA as a part of an environmental justice law school roadshow program. And so today I wanted to speak to you about migration, climate change, environmental justice, and mass incarceration, all of which are inextricably linked. We can no longer draw neat borders around the environmentalism of white spaces, of first world countries, and climate change adaptation. And more so, what we are seeing is that the environmentalism and climate change adaptation can no longer be the exclusive domain of protecting white spaces. We are also seeing that There is quite a bit of upheaval that is happening, especially in poor areas where there's conflict as well as political upheaval. We are also seeing internal displacement as well as international displacement. And this is really intensified during moments of natural disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, as well as the horrors that we have seen from famine, disease such as COVID, religious violence, and people are constantly moving as a result of that. We are a planet of populations on the move. The arrest and detention of rapper 21 Savage a couple years ago really highlights the lens of the carceral state and the idea of environmentalism. And it also shows the constraints of environmental law and the pressures on environmental advocates. We are seeing that the United States and other nations have really disproportionately impacted carbon emissions and should really work to accept the climate change refugees as a form of compensation to them and as a form of justice. These were ideas that were put forward by Columbia Law professor Michael Gerard. And it's really important to really contextualize this because we need to see that the rash of immigration detentions, deportations, and self-deportations also highlights environmental struggles. And a lot of these struggles and how they have worked show that there's quite a bit of hegemonic unison in terms of how this has been happening. And so before we would look at immigration and see that it would be the domain of political asylum cases, as well as cases involving highly educated professionals. But climate change has really expanded those struggles in ways that we have not seen before. And the arrest of 21 Savage in Atlanta and a later blackout in a New York federal prison and the arrest of meatpacking workers in Mississippi are not isolated events, but taken together, they are part of the wider net of mass incarceration to silence environmental, labor, and human rights, as well as examples of denying access to protection from environmental impacts. Climate change is going to increase extreme weather conditions, as well as increase vulnerabilities for those at the margins, from prison populations to those who are attempting to cross the borders. And these incidences that we have seen are a way to preserve an economic system known as corporatism through racist immigration and incarceration policies, which later manifest in disparate responses to environmental pollution, from concerns from the Flint water crisis to the protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline. In Flint, Michigan, residents are paying fines for not paying bills for polluted water. In North Dakota, protesters are arrested for their direct action to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. In other words, caging is a strategy, both legal, financial, and political, that is used against the critics of the corporatist system, which capitalizes upon and targets marginalized communities and vulnerable populations. And the impacts of corporatism are also environmental, and that these impacts work to silence environmental efforts and to demonstrate the adverse impacts of climate change on frontline communities. And the way to kind of really look at that is that vulnerable communities that are located in sacrifice zones are seen as having less of a right to be here in the United States or on the planet, and therefore require less of a need for a clean environment, including less of a need for clean air, water, and energy access. And when we look at this idea of the American logic of the carceral state, it really also mirrors other countries that have also implemented punitive and lengthy prison sentences, which adversely impact marginalized communities. In the process of increased carcerality, we could see that, there's a process of increased prisons that is happening independently across the globe. Yet after investigating, reporting has suggested, in fact, the US Department of State has been providing rule of law initiatives to expand carcerality in foreign countries. So not only has America expanded its own systems, the American idea of the carceral state has also been expanding through the rule of law programs for prison systems. And changes in the carceral state that may actually reduce crime and carcerality tend to be ignored in favor of programs which increase construction of prisons and create jobs for prison workers. And so public attention really has to be diverted away is actually being diverted away from programs that will bring substantive reform. And one of the changes that we have seen that is very major is the executive order to end private prisons. And so that is really, I think, a baseline and a way that we can move forward. But also we need to look at other issues involving police practices, prosecutorial discretion, decision-making, and sentencing guidelines for judges. And also seeing that carceral citizenship has an immobilizing impact on individuals and communities and strips them of citizenship and creates tiers of citizenship as well. And further, it's really important to also see the increased frequency and intensity of immigration raids has created uncertainty, fear, and trauma, as well as the increased incidences of police brutality. On the first day of school on August 8th, 2019, immigration officials conducted a raid in Mississippi. They rounded up 690 undocumented workers in 7 food processing plants in Mississippi, and most of them were undocumented workers who were from a village in Guatemala. And you had a Catholic cardinal, Alvaro Ramazzini, who had traveled to Mississippi to show solidarity with the Guatemalan immigrants who were subjected to large state deportation raid. And it was the largest U.S. Deportation raid in U.S. history. And he told the workers there that you are not criminals. You are here because your own country was not able to give you what you have a right to have. And research at Columbia University is also showing that impacts of climate change on heating and cooling conditions in prison has impacted prisons and conditions in prison. There's also risk factors for succumbing to heat-related illnesses such as advanced age, poor health and physical health, and use of medications are all prevalent among 2.2 million US inmates. And heat is also causing serious harm to inmates and correctional officers. Another instance where atmospheric dynamics will impact prison populations and the integrity of the prison structure is during extreme weather events. When Hurricane Dorian headed to Bahamas along Florida's coast, where I am located, the Florida Department of Corrections moved more than 4,000 inmates to other facilities to avoid risk from the weather. And as a result of damage to prisons during Hurricane Michael in 2018, more than 3,000 inmates were transferred to these facilities, some of which did not have running water or heating and cooling systems. The reach of mass incarceration is going to create what I refer to as climate cages versus workable solutions to climate change. In light of the dire predictions of climate change that is going to lead to the possible mass extinction of tens of millions of humans by mid-century, a solution for the survival of our species, as well as the broader ecosystems, should work not just on construction and fortifications of buildings which incarcerate individuals, and the lessening of laws that criminalize immigration, as well as imprison frontline communities is in disproportionate rates, is absolutely essential. And so what we really have to do is to really halt the level of mass extinction we are facing. We have to have the complete and absolute divestment from fossil fuel development, as well as the abolition of prisons and immigration and customs enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. It touched on a lot of things that actually overlap with many of the panelists today. So I look forward to the Q&A and the discussion aspects later. I want to go to Lindsay Heck, an associate at White & Case, the excellent firm with a phenomenal and famed pro bono practice. And she comes with her own extensive pro bono practice, having worked on matters of lead poisoning in Flint, and working with victims of sex trafficking to achieve money damages from the criminals involved. And she's appeared on MSNBC and on the front page of NYT. So I'll leave it to that. Thank you, Lindsay. Please take it from there.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. This is such an important and timely topic and lecture series, because, of course, the nation in this moment is really confronting the collision of 4 crises: a public health crisis, an economic downturn, and what we're focusing on today, systemic racism and a burgeoning environmental crisis. And Flint really stands at the epicenter. It's the one place in the nation where all of these forces coalesced, not over the course of just the past year, but over the course of the last 7 years. In Flint, the lead crisis was entirely preventable. It was not merely fueled by government policy, it was really created by it. In April 2014, an unelected emergency manager changed Flint's water source to the Flint River in an ill-conceived attempt to save money. Previously, Flint's water supply was derived from Detroit's water system, which came from Lake Huron. Now, Flint, of course, is not in the middle of a water desert. It's in the middle of the Great Lakes region in this country. It's in the middle of a supply of clean water, and yet its water source was changed to the Flint River, which was essentially a sewage dump. Immediately after the switch, the highly acidic water started corroding the pipes, which were predominantly lead-based, and then lead from the city's aging pipes began leaching into its water supply. Now, lead poisoning is often referred to and known as a silent epidemic, but the people in Flint were not silent. They raised their voices. After the water switch, there was public outcry about the brown, smelly water. 6 months after the switch, while the citizens of Flint were reassured that their water was safe to drink, General Motors took its plant off of the Flint water supply because the water was corroding engine parts. And yet, it was more than a year before anything was done for the 100,000 people living in the city, approximately 30,000 of whom were children. In October 2015, 18 months after the water switch, the government finally acknowledged that there was lead in the water after repeated denials. At this point, it was necessary to design an unprecedented response to an unprecedented crisis in Flint. And one of the first things that needed to be done was to ensure that the people of Flint would have a safe water supply on a going forward basis. And that's what Jeremy will be discussing. However, another important aspect of the response was figuring out what to do for those who had already been exposed to lead in the water for a period of at least 18 months. They had been poisoned. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that, when ingested, affects every organ system in the body, but most importantly, most significantly, the brain. It leads to irreversible brain damage. Lead, unfortunately, strikes at the very foundations of cognition. It has profound effects on learning, memory, and behavior. And so I'm going to try to share with you a slide that helps to illustrate this. This slide shows the impact of lead poisoning, and this is on a child. I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. This is the effect of poisoning on a child who was tested. And this picture was shown to the child and then was withdrawn from them. And children who have not been exposed to lead, this is what they can redraw from memory a few minutes later. Almost everything. This is what a lead poisoned child can draw. By contrast, it's hardly even got the outline. And this is after only a few minutes. So that really, I wanted to show that just because it illustrates how insidious lead is. If children can't remember, even after a few minutes, what they've just learned, how do you educate them? It just shows that really significantly, exposure to lead, especially during early childhood, can change the entire trajectory of a child's life. And as the pediatrician who sounded the alarm about the crisis said, if you are going to put one thing in a community to keep them down, not just for this generation, but for generations to come, it would be lead. It would be lead poisoning. It would be exactly what you saw happen in Flint. And the problem is that there is no cure for lead poisoning. There's no magic pill that can erase it, but brain injury, fortunately, can be mitigated. And because there's no medical intervention that can completely counter the effects of lead poisoning, what we realized early on is that education is the answer. That is the antidote to the poisoning that the children in Flint have endured. The White and Case, along with the Education Law Center and the ACLU of Michigan in 2016, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the 30,000 children who were poisoned by lead in the water in Flint. And the lawsuit really recognized that the schools have to be at the front lines of a response to this crisis. And most importantly, that they have to be equipped with the resources that they need to effectively carry out that response. With well-resourced and high-functioning schools, both the cognitive and behavioral effects of lead exposure can be mitigated. But in Flint, the problem was that decades of educational disinvestment had resulted in underfunded and underperforming schools that were failing their students even before the lead crisis dramatically increased students' needs. Appallingly, the long-standing funding issues only got worse instead of getting better after the lead crisis. In October 2015, when the government finally acknowledged that there was lead in the water, Flint School District was facing a crippling deficit of $10 million. That was the inflection point. That was the moment for the government to come in and say resources have to be funneled into the Flint schools. But instead, what happened was that the state straitjacketed the school district by freezing wages for teachers and staff. The upshot was that 3 years later, by October 2018, you had a student population where 1 out of every 5 children needed special education services, and 1 out of every 4 special education teaching positions was vacant, was unfilled. So it was an alarming, perfect storm. And essentially, children who were mass poisoned by their own government then were abandoned by that very same government. And so when we started the case, we realized very quickly that there were really 3 key areas where the schools were failing students. Number 1, they were failing to identify children's disabilities. Number 2, they were failing to actually provide children with programs and services to address those disabilities. And number 3, and outrageously, they were then blaming children for behavioral manifestations of those very same disabilities. So this had become a perpetuating cycle, which we were seeking to break through the case. And one of our representative plaintiffs really puts this cycle into sharp relief. As a 6-year-old, he was suspended from school over 30 times and charged with over 50 infractions. His mother told us that one of these disciplinary incidents culminated with him being thrown to the ground and a knee put in his back at the age of 6 years old. He then was pushed out of school and found himself in a virtual school far before it became the new normal. And he's segregated from his classmates, from social interaction. He's isolated from his peers, and he doesn't have a teacher to believe in him. So what we did is we really focused on 3 pillars that the settlement that we recently reached achieves. And the first is to, at the foundational level, identify children's disabilities. And we succeeded in getting a $4 million medical center built in Flint that, among other things, offers state-of-the-art neuropsychological testing, the only testing that's uniquely calibrated to detect lead's impact on the brain. You saw an example of that testing visual memory. With the results of that testing, the schools can use it to tailor educational interventions to students' cognitive strengths and to capitalize on those strengths. We also made sure that we have resources that will now be funneled into the district, and that training will be provided so that teachers will understand that behavioral outbursts are manifestations of need instead of cause for punishment. And I just wanted to close with a story that one of our teachers in the Flint schools told us. She spoke to us about her class of second and third grade students. And their classroom pet, a bearded dragon, lived in a water tank, and it actually passed away due to the lead in the water. And she started getting bombarded with questions from the children saying, our classroom pet died, we drank the water like it did, are we gonna die too? And we live in a country where no child should have to ask, am I gonna die like my classroom pet? Flint is a microcosm of poor policy decisions that have systematically impacted underserved people of color. But this is not just a Flint problem. This is a national problem, and it is a racial problem. We know that there are more Flints out there. There's many poor urban communities with deteriorating infrastructures and failing schools that serve predominantly Black and brown children. Some of these communities, Providence, Baltimore, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Newark, just to name a few, have also struggled with lead in their water. And the model that we created in Flint is not only a model that will transform the educational system for Flint children, it's a model that can be followed in communities outside of Flint with aging infrastructures that may be similarly affected. The stakes at this point have never been higher. This is children's future that's on the line. This is their childhood, and in Flint, they will finally receive an education worthy of their promise as a result of this case. But Flint is now a symbol of resilience and hope, and hopefully the rest of the nation will be able to learn from its lessons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindsay. That's great. And there's a couple of quick questions before we go to Jeremy. Could you post into the chat the link to the study that you shared the screen for, and which would note how many students were studied and that sort of thing. And also to voice Meg Glassman's question, is lead a forever chemical? Or sorry, that's Melissa Slater's question. Is it a forever chemical like PFOAs? Is it ever processed out of the body?
No, it stays in the body, and it's deposited anywhere where you would find calcium in the body. So it goes into your bones, it goes into your brain, into the synapses between brain cells. And unfortunately, in women who are pregnant, when the developing fetus draws what should be calcium from their bones to nurture their baby, if they've been lead poisoned, it will draw lead from their bones. And this is why it's an intergenerational problem. And this is why it is so very serious.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And the overall estimate of how many children were effectively lead poisoned in Flint, do you know what that is?
So unfortunately, there's not a conclusive number because blood lead level testing will only detect lead in the blood for a very transient window of time. But given that there were about approximately 30,000 children on the water supply during this period, we can assume that they were poisoned every time that they drank the water, every time that mothers prepared bottles for their children, every time they mixed it with mac and cheese. They were being exposed. Every time they took a bath, they would come out with rashes, many of our plaintiffs.
Mm-hmm. So the funding gap persists, and the funding gap that existed in education was mirrored exactly with the funding gap in infrastructure, which also let them down, right? And so those two have come together. But of course, we've also extended into a funding gap in dealing with it properly, right? Because the systems have been set up to do exactly that. So I really appreciate your work on that, Lindsay. And I wanted to hand it off to Jeremy for now, staff attorney with the Safe Water Initiative at the NRDC, dear friend of mine, an EJ committee member, and an EJ attorney doing it all, but we'll especially focus on Safe Drinking Water Act issues for communities of color, starting with Flint.
Thanks, Scott, and happy to talk about these issues, and happy to be a part of this, this series this month to lift up some of these issues. So as Scott mentioned, my background, I've been an attorney at NRDC on our Safe Water Initiative for a few years now. Prior to that, worked as the environmental justice attorney for the Transnational Environmental Law Clinic, which is based in Michigan, and after that worked for the People's Climate Movement as a national director working on climate justice issues. And I got my start mostly in grassroots community organizing before deciding to kind of go to law school and take that kind of advocacy to the court and elsewhere. So my role at NRDC, I work on what's called our Safe Water Initiative, which is essentially our drinking water program where we deal with water issues from source to tap. And our goal on a daily basis is to secure safe, affordable drinking water as a human right. So in that, I work on Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement, as well as some Clean Water Act issues, predominantly around contamination. Mainly as was mentioned in one of the questions, being lead and PFAS contamination around the country. Another significant component of my work, which I'll talk about here, is access to water, in particular when we talk about shutoffs and connections and reconnections, as well as affordability, and just this crisis as we've seen water in many regions around the country double and triple in rate over the last 10 years, and how communities of color, EJ communities, are disproportionately impacted by that. So, just for some context and building off of, the Flint work that Lindsay began to talk about, I'm going to share a bit about the environmental side of that case, particularly a lawsuit that NRDC was a part of working to secure safe water for the folks of Flint. So, we're coming up on, again, right, every kind of, March, April, we get into this time frame of thinking of the anniversary of when, this water was switched over. And just to give a little procedural history from a legal standpoint, and talk a bit about the case that NRDC worked on. So in November of 2015, NRDC filed a notice of lawsuit. Essentially, in federal court, you give a notice of a time frame that you're planning to sue. We filed our complaint shortly after in January of 2016, noting that our complaint was a Safe Drinking Water Act complaint. So this was in January 2016. In that time frame, a couple of months later, we got a preliminary injunction, from the court, and in an ensuing hearing, right? We were awarded that the state would be ordered to provide bottled water to every home until or unless filters were verified. I'd say, shortly, after that, the governor at the time, Governor Rick Snyder, who we've seen, in recent weeks come under now criminal indictment for these actions. He wrote a letter to the court saying, he was interested in mediation. He wanted to prompt the judge to begin a mediation process. Mediation took place, over the course of from January to March of 2017. And after months of that, we reached a settlement through negotiations in March of 2017. The significant terms of that settlement were that it was done through a consent decree, which is enforceable in court, legally enforceable. So whenever issues come back up with this settlement, we could take it back to the federal court, and that'll be, that ended up being significant in our pursuit of justice here. So it was through a consent decree. We secured $97 million to go towards securing safe drinking water in the city of Flint. 87 million of that, I believe, came from the state, with 57 million of that came from the state, 40 million from the federal government. And of that, 87 million was to be used directly for a number of things, and 10 million to be put on reserve, kind of as a in case we need to revisit some things, or we need those additional funds to work on different parts of the settlement that be available. Most notably, what was secured in this settlement was lead service line replacement, full lead service line replacement at no cost to the residents of Flint within a 3-year window. And that included the excavation of, close to, I think, 18,000 lines. We've exceeded that number since then. The other piece of this, which was critical, was the implementation of a filter program in which the city was required to provide filters to everybody, who had wanted them, and provide filter replacements for that as well. Required independent tap monitoring for an extended period of time, which is significant because, as we talked about, right, this was a democracy issue in which, residents were lied to by their state and federal government, right, about the monitoring and the sampling and what was going on. So we ensure for some extended period of time that tap monitoring would be done by an independent party to ensure that the water was safe as it began to be fixed. And it also included some health programs, in particular, that folks could tap into. So this was, as mentioned in 2017, we ended up, and as I mentioned, this was a consent decree. So we ended up going back to court in early 2019 to ensure a few more, components of or key terms of that settlement. One was that there was a window in which the model that had been used to successfully, identify where lead pipes were and replace them. There was a point in which the city began to use a different method, right? A method that was separate from what had been successful. So we went to court to return to the original method, which was efficient, which was much more efficient and successful at finding and replacing pipes. We also went back to ensure that homes that were likely to have lead service lines were prioritized. So instead of just kind of fishing in the dark, we knew that we needed to ensure that the most vulnerable communities were prioritizing lead service line replacement. We also went back to require monthly reporting of the project, as well as reporting on the use of funds, and then implement a conference to address funding as the settlement began to wind down. That was in early 2019. We ended up going back to court again in late 2020, last fall, as the city felt that the project was beginning to wind down, and they believed that they had satisfied, their settlement terms. We went back to fight to say, COVID has put, your work off for X amount of months. And that was essentially the argument that, with COVID slowing things down, they felt like they had done enough. They should, just be able to wrap it up. And we went back to court to say, no, we have an agreement. You need to get to as many, get to every, lead service line and ensure that everybody has an option to get their lead service line replaced. And we were able to win that as well in court and extend that timeline. So that work continues as well. And I'll say many of, the overwhelming majority of pipes in Flint have been replaced. We're talking 90%. We're in the waning days of that work, and hopefully, be able to say potentially this year, hopefully, right, that all of the necessary lead pipes have been replaced, and that the city has completed their work there to ensure that folks have access to safe drinking water from an engineering standpoint. But Flint is just one example of this, right? Flint is the one that's been lifted up for obvious reasons, right? As was mentioned early on, it's a convergence of so many different justice issues in one, right? But through my work, I think I see every day that that these issues are happening all over the country, right, everywhere. And I just want to highlight, a couple of recent reports that kind of evidence these injustices taking place. One in particular was a report produced by Natural Resources Defense Council called Water Down Justice, which was released in, I think, 2019. Right, the study essentially analyzed nationwide violations of Safe Drinking Water Act and the relationship between socio-demographic characteristics and drinking water violations. So essentially, it was looking at the comparison between poor water quality and a few different socio-demographic characteristics. Of all the factors studied, in that report, race, had the strongest relationship to slow and inadequate enforcement of Safe Drinking Water Act law, especially in Black communities. Right. It also noted that drinking water systems in places with higher proportions of people of color, in particular, Black residents, tended to spend more time out of compliance with the law for more violations, for more contaminants. Right. So to kind of break that down, when they are in violation, they spend more time significantly out of violation as opposed to being fixed, as well as they have more violations in other communities. In addition to that, they have more violations for more chemicals and toxins as well. So not just lead or PFAS, but other things in their water too. And I'll say on top of that, even with the problems, even when problems are identified, and folks are out of compliance, we see that the problem remains uncorrected despite action. So even though enforcement action may be taken, even though your federal state government may say, hey, we're going to slap you on the wrist and penalize you for these actions, we find that polluters, water systems, are more likely to still remain out of compliance and not even comply with those penalties, or even if they do, comply with the monetary, penalty of it, they're still likely to be out of compliance in that, in communities of color, in particular Black communities. And I would say another report would be the NAACP Legal Defense Fund released A Color of Water in 2019, right? And it looked at access to water and affordability in the nexus of race. So here we're talking about whether or not people can pay for water, can afford to pay for water, in particular communities of color, right? And what they found was, the higher rates of water paid by communities of color and in environmental justice communities, water debt and the cost of water puts you at risk, much higher risk for losing your home, for having your service terminated, right, shut off, for having a water lien, what we call liens placed on your home, which is essentially if you don't pay your water bill in many places, they can then attach it to your property taxes. And if you don't pay that on your property taxes, they can then foreclose on your home, which we believe to be unconstitutional foreclosures in the places that I've seen this taking place. Eviction, if you don't own your home. And then really critical is the losing of your family, right? As we've seen, right? If you don't have running water in your home and you have kids, you're at risk of having your children taken out of your custody, and even criminal charges in some instances. And as I wrap up, I'll say that the way I've seen environmental law and environmental enforcement in my career has been very similar to criminal law and enforcement, right? If you're if you're white, if you're wealthy, you're affluent, you'll at least get your day in court, right? If you're coming in contact with the criminal justice system. If you're a person of color, Black, brown, poor, you're much less likely to get justice, right? You're arrested at higher rates, you're over prosecuted, you're overcharged. You're subject to mass incarceration. You don't make it home from stops in some occasions, right? You're killed by police at higher rates, and the list goes on. And the parallels I draw there is I see the same with environmental law and enforcement, right? If you're in if you're in the wealthier communities and more affluent white communities, you don't have these same environmental injustices. You don't face them, right? Especially when it comes to water. And as we've seen in communities of color, we tend to pay higher water bills. Communities that built and own water systems are paying higher rates of subsidizing the rates of white suburbs. We see higher rates of shutoffs in communities of color. We have higher rates of, as I mentioned, Safe Drinking Water Act violations, which lead to higher rates of toxic exposure. And I think to close this out, for me, this is in some instances it is intentional, it is by design, and some reason it's just, in some instances it's just a byproduct of it. But nonetheless, whether it's intentional or just simply by impact, it's still the way we handle environmental law in many areas in this country, especially drinking water, seem to be rooted in structural racism that needs to be remedied. Thank you.
That's beautiful, Jeremy. And I appreciate that you also pointed out just how ubiquitous these conditions are in the country, that Flint is not an outlier. Flint just happened to be that convergence of factors that allowed it to come to the sort of social level that people knew what was going on there, but that Flints are happening all over the country in Black and brown and Indigenous communities, and not just from water issues. And so I really appreciate that, Jeremy. Well, I want to go to Tara Houska, founder, GNU Collective, an attorney specializing in Native American EJ issues and really at the forefront of the combination of activism and advocacy to yield results for these types of communities. So Tara, tell us a little bit about your work and these matters, please.
Bushu Ginawa, and thank you to all the speakers who came before. Jabawekwe and Dojnakas Makwan Dudim, Kuchting and Junchuba. My name is Tara Houska. I'm Bear Clan from Kuchting First Nation. I'm Anishinaabe, calling in from Anishinaabe territory, talking with you guys actually directly from a pipeline resistance camp that we formed about 3 years ago, fighting Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands that's threatening to destroy and rend our territories and rip apart our sacred places. Calling you knowing that right down the road so we're about 200 yards off the proposed Line 3 route, and right down the road from us, there's a bunch of loggers and fellow bunchers and security, private security, and past that, there is a mobile command center with a bunch of sheriffs and police officers and private security and law enforcement that's all waiting and watching and surveilling, sitting at the forefront of a corporate response and a corporate-led control of our public institutions. What happens when, in this instance, in northern Minnesota, where the company has actually directly entered into agreements with local law enforcement, where the sheriffs are actually being paid through public safety escrows to any costs incurred by Line 3. So yeah, a little tiny town like Park Rapids, Minnesota, where there's 3,000 people, now has a tank. That happened and showed up over the summer, and have seen a number of different police officers carrying around assault rifles and all the things intended to suppress and oppress our people. I guess some of the work and background, I started as a lawyer in DC and worked in a number of different offices. First internship was actually at CEQ, working on Keystone XL, and it's interesting to see where that's ended now, finally, all these years later. Then worked for private practice and hundreds of nations across the country, across Turtle Island on different matters on the Hill. And worked with Bernie Sanders during his 2016 campaign, worked on the tribal, I was a lead author for the tribal policy platform. And then I went out to Standing Rock, North Dakota, and that has dramatically and forever shifted the path of my work and efforts for our people and for the environment around us. To me, you don't get to racial, social, gender justice without a habitable planet to live on. We simply cannot continue to progress without clean water and clean air and soil to grow our food. Some of the things that I've actually heard yesterday in preparation for this call, like, had me thinking about place and what it means to be from a place. I am from this place. It's the place of my ancestors, and it's something that sits deeply in our hearts. It is very difficult to describe to the larger societal narrative what it means to see a place that holds the footsteps of your ancestors and your way of life ripped apart in front of you. It is a cultural genocide that's happening. It's happening all over Turtle Island and around the world. The indigenous peoples of this planet are telling the larger world that our actions are unsustainable, that our pursuit of comfort at the cost of others is not a effort that is being received well by our mother. Climate crisis is happening. Global warming is happening. Rising seas are everywhere, and we know this as the people of this place that we're in. North America knows that we're just some of the least impacted by climate crisis, yet we are also blind to the existing crimes that are happening within this beautiful place. The climate refugees that are already here in Turtle Island, they're Native people being pushed back in Alaska, Native people being pushed back in Louisiana, our indigenous territories going underwater, and the ongoing expansion of fossil fuels and extractive economy in our places and spaces. We got put onto reservations, and now they're coming for the last of those pieces. I speak as a person whose grandmother was put through residential school by this country that we're in right now. The attempted cultural genocide through the removal of the Indian from the man, which was the policy of the federal government up to the mid 1900s, all the way into the 70s. The Indian Child Welfare Act and all of that was passed in the late 70s. What we're talking about is the intersectionality of race and environment. Racial justice is environmental justice. Those two issues are intertwined in so many different ways. The pipelines and mines and refineries and lead contamination and the Superfund sites. And all of these places are in spaces that are largely Black and brown. They're in spaces that are largely low wealth. The forgotten people, essentially, or the people that we are, as a larger society, saying don't matter as much, that our lives don't matter quite as much. Where I am right now is northern Minnesota. In southern Minnesota, that was where George Floyd was murdered, and spurred protests that were felt, I think, by this country in a way that hasn't happened in many, many decades. That suddenly, as we were all gripped into our homes and into our hope for safety during the pandemic, that we were all paying attention to each other and to what was really happening. It wasn't just Black and brown folks watching, it was all of us. And through that, we saw the racial oppression and supremacy that is so present. And to me, those liberations and those liberatory movements of Black justice, brown justice, Indigenous justice, they are intertwined together. Northern Minnesota, we just had Ilhan Omar, Representative Ilhan Omar, come here. She's our Minneapolis rep. She came here because she recognizes this is a racial justice too. That just because Native people happen to be some of the most invisible people in this country, even though you're all on our land, that we matter also, that our territories matter and our futures matter, that cultural genocide should no longer be the norm, and that we should never be starting from a place of, well, somebody has to pay the cost somewhere and some sacrifice zones are okay in our pursuit of comfort, or in this case, the fossil fuel industry's pursuit of endless expansion. This project I've been part of fighting for so many years is an expansion project out of the Alberta tar sands. It's a 10% expansion of those tar sands mines. I've been up in that territory, and I've also been at the terminus, been to the refineries over in Detroit, where it's Black and brown communities that are largely breathing in the toxic fumes from the tar sands, and then up at the source, where it is Indigenous communities that are dealing with the cancer clusters and man camps and increased violence and so many other aspects that come along with these projects. I guess I don't know. I mean, we're all talking and we all have so many different things to say, and a lot of them are really sad things that I know are very near and dear to those of us who work so closely on them. I hope that for the lawyers who are trying to find ways to uplift and support the many injustices, achieving justice across this place and others, that we do our best to center ourselves and center our own hearts into what it is that we're doing. And to me, that I think all of us as human beings could stand with a dose of reality that we cannot live without water. We cannot live without soil. We cannot live without air. I spend so much of my adult life trying to remind fossil fuel executives and corporate financiers and every imaginable layer of society those simple truths, that we can do a lot more to hold on to this lesson that Mother Nature is teaching us in the pandemic, which is that we care about each other first and foremost. I think a lot of us have realized what's really important to us, and that's our families, it's our friends, it's our loved ones, it's our connections, our interconnections with each other. To remember that in everything that we do and all the actions that we take, and to not get too caught up in our own humanness, but to remember those basic truths and that basic love for each other. I think that's all I'm going to share today. So, miigwech for the time and for the space. Please learn about tribal sovereignty if you don't already know. Please reach out to the Biden administration if you want to support our fight to stop Line 3. Visit stopline3.org. And Yeah, if you don't know who the local tribal nations are in your area, please find out. There are maps to do it. You can certainly find out and talk to the folks that are around. There is no, I think that as a society, we should be looking at the canary in the mine, and indigenous peoples are the canary in the mine of the world. We're 5% of the population, holding 80% of its biodiversity, just 5%. So,
And that reminds me of the school pet that was the canary in the coal mine in Flint, that water killed, and reiterate this concept of disposable places and disposable people. That like you said, Tara, that there's this hierarchy that's been built, that the system decides that some people are worth more than others, and some animals are worth more than others, and some areas are worth more than others, and that is a cultural system. And it tees up so well, Tara, our next speaker, my dear friend, Barrett Holmes Pittner, who is the world's expert on the concept of ethnocide. And he laughs, but he is literally the world's expert on ethnocide, and which is a concept I'll let him explain, but it very much builds on what Tara just spoke to. And Barrett is the founder and philosopher in chief at the Sustainable Culture Lab, and a lecturer on journalism at George Washington University, as well as an advisory board member with me on the Dignity Rights Initiative at the ABA Center for Human Rights. So I will leave the rest to him. Thank you, Barrett.
Yeah, thanks for that glowing introduction. I'm the world's expert. But just to continue with what Tara said and what everyone's been saying, like I'm the one non-lawyer on this panel, and my work focuses a lot on philosophy and language and culture. And my work took this focus when I was a journalist writing about race and culture, and I just felt that our existing language didn't adequately give us the words to describe the nature of our problems and the scope of these problems. I think the language of race kind of confined us to these fabricated limitations. And when you're working within these restrictions, it makes it harder to find the real solutions to these problems. And from my perspective, it was always a cultural problem. And so I started exploring words that could articulate what I saw. And the word that I came across was ethnocide. And that word was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide in 1944. He also created ethnocide because genocide was the destruction of people, the genos, and ethnocide was the destruction of a culture or a nation of people. And since during the Holocaust, they were targeting Jewish people, it was a genos and an ethnos interwoven. But as the term genocide got more adopted into international law, components of ethnocide became subsumed under genocide. And now the new meaning of ethnocide emerged, which is the destruction of culture while keeping the people. And at first, European anthropologists would use this language to describe things that occurred to indigenous people in the Americas in recent times, where they would be forced off their land or their land would be destroyed. And that was a destruction of the culture of these indigenous people, but the people physically still remained. And they were using the language of ethnocide to describe that. What I'm also, in addition to that, doing at the Sustainable Culture Lab is we're using that language to describe the transatlantic slave trade, because the goal of that was to extract African people from the land, the culture of Africa, forcefully remove their African culture by breaking up families, preventing them from using their language, practicing their religion, wearing their indigenous clothing, anything that could identify their culture to allow them to bond and get organized, was just systematically destroyed. And the goal was so that in the Americas, they could create a new society, colonizers could create a new society of perpetual division, where one class of people who were European colonizers, who would then decide to call themselves white, would be the ones who could exploit African people in perpetuity in this dynamic of perpetual division. And, then they would give African people all these dehumanizing identifiers, which we are no longer socially acceptable to say in society today. And so this dynamic of ethnocide is a foundational component of American existence, and our systemic division and oppression are natural byproducts of ethnocide. And when I talk about ethnocide a lot, one thing that gets overlooked is the environment impact of it, where the point of it was after colonizers had forcefully removed indigenous people or killed many indigenous people from their land, engaged in a genocide, they then brought African people to then cultivate that land in a way where it was made for the financial benefit of colonizers, but not to sustain African people. And so we have this connection of complete detachment from place, where indigenous people were removed from their place, and African people had a connection to a foreign place, not as something to sustain them, but something that they had a relation to in order to make profit for white Americans and colonizers. And this is just tragic at a very foundational level that I don't think we have the language to really talk about and just articulate how tragic that is and how it still shapes our life today. And when you think about so one thing that always pops up when I talk about ethnocide is, what do I mean by culture? Because culture is a lot of things. But when you start focusing on culture, what really you notice is that the first thing that creates culture is an attachment to place. Like the place in which you live shapes how you interact with so many people. It shapes the houses that you build, the clothes that you wear, the words that you create, how you speak, whether you have a language that with a lot of hand gestures or one that your hands are in your pockets, is going to be largely determined by whether it's warm or cold where you live. Things like this shape people in such a way that we just kind of overlook how profound that is. And then when you look at the United States, America's tried to create a culture where people don't have an attachment to place. Indigenous people, even to this day, Tara's there fighting right now. We have a society that inclines people to remove that attachment to place from indigenous people. African Americans, the attachment that we have to this place is that we get to live in the places that they determine are disposable. So this is where you can put polluted lead water and just say, this is what we can do. And they'll make that calculation because it's profitable to poison the disposable people who live in a disposable place. And the people that are doing it are, they don't really even have a cultural attachment to that place. They will live in an environment that they live there because it brings them money, not because they're trying to create culture or have a sustainable culture in any way. And so when we're talking about the environment and we're trying to make our environmental justice and everything more racially equitable, we need to understand that the major impediment and our perspective and how we address these issues and articulate them and how we address each other and interact with each other as we combat all of this is the profound removal of an attachment to place, and how normal that is to just American life in general, where at a very foundational level, the expectation for most people is that you'll leave home and go to some other part of America to conquer that area and make money. And you won't, the idea of living next to your parents or having a multi-generational home and like your entire family living in the same area for generations after generations is like an idea that's very foreign to Americans, but is just common practice for the rest of the world because people are accustomed to having that attachment to their place and that shaping how they decide to live with other people and their, how they perceive everything around them. And so the language of ethnocide, I think, helps provide us with language and structures to really look at what we're doing at a cultural level, because the key thing is that culture isn't something that's passive or static. It's something that you actually have to create. And so when you focus on culture, it allows you to transcend racial divisions, where if you acknowledge that we're all in the same place, we're here trying to make a culture together, and not a culture where one group is getting exploited in perpetuity and another group tries to come up with language that justifies perpetual exploitation. Now we're at a new place, and it can make it easier for people across a racial divide to collaborate and work together. And so like, I feel the language of ethnocide helps cultivate that. And I think this panel shows how across a racial division, we are all focusing on how these issues impact Americans of all walks of life and how we need to focus it collectively to improve the lives of everybody else. And one thing I want to add is just like two like really quick stories and why I'm just happy to talk about ethnocide in relation to the environment is that one of my first conversations is about ethnocide early on was with a friend of mine who's a professor of environmental studies at in New York, and we were talking about food deserts, and we had a conversation over what he meant by environment. And we realized that when he would say environment, he was talking about like parks and the outdoors. And when I was saying environment, I was talking about like concrete jungles that they created for African Americans that don't have grocery stores, and they get all their produce at like at supermarket, you know, at gas stations and 7-Elevens. Like that's the environment that these people, that a lot of people in America live in, and they don't get to go to a park. They don't have, you know, the amount of people that live in DC that never have been to the mall, and they live in another part of DC that doesn't get government funding because it's predominantly Black. When we have the language of environment, we need to make sure that that environment is not just the trees that people of privilege that might not recognize the privilege they have call the environment, that word environment actually incorporates these concrete, you know, prisons essentially that people are living in without the resources to adequately live or grow their own food or any of that kind of stuff. And so I think that's really, really significant, how language plays a big role in our capacity to communicate with each other and find that common ground to make the change we need. And then the last thing, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, in Marietta. And as an African-American in a very predominantly white conservative area, I didn't really have an attachment to place. And I still don't have an attachment to place for Marietta. But one thing I noticed that was always troubling for me is I lived in Cobb County, and the county right above us, which was known as like a very conservative white county, was called Cherokee County. And there weren't Cherokee people there. And we lived in an environment where we just acted as if it made sense for a bunch of people to live in an area that was named after the people who used to live there, and they don't live there anymore. And we don't seem to see that that's problematic. You know, school time would happen, we would get educated about like the Trail of Tears, and that would take maybe one day. And we literally lived adjacent to Cherokee County. And it made me think of just like how casual your society can make a genocide appear in your education system as you live right next to it. And that always bothered me. And I'd never had the language to really adequately express how that bothered me as a kid. And I would always, when we would go on vacation into like northern Georgia, my parents loved this place called Helen, Georgia, which is very weird because it's a German themed town in Georgia. Some Georgia person went to Germany and said, man, the landscape here is a lot like the Appalachian Mountains. And he came back with this scheme to turn this area into like a little German village. And so like a lot of Georgians love to escape to this little German village in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. One of the most absurd ideas ever. And as a kid, it still cracks me up that like, I was like, yeah, we're going to Helen, Georgia. But on the drive up to Helen, Georgia, we'd go through Cherokee County. We'd go through all these areas that indigenous people lived and had lived for thousands of years. And we'd see Indian mounds. And it was just kind of like oh, okay, maybe that'll be like a class field trip one day. But it was just a casual discussion about how all of these people, our society had just erased, yet we had the landmarks, we had the names, we had all this stuff, and there was never an impetus to have a conversation about that. And that really, really has always perturbed me and frustrated me. And it's just important that when we talk about these discussions now with an attachment to place, we make sure that indigenous people have a place in all these conversations, because like we're learning this place largely, you know, secondhand. No, not largely, like entirely secondhand, and we can't be good at it unless we let the people who have been here for thousands of years share their wisdom and respect their knowledge. And so there we go.
Thank you, Barry. That's beautiful. And we've got a lot of questions. And I just want to say one thing to reiterate. Everyone up here has ways to get involved with them and their pursuits. So please, your questions are how do you can get involved? A number of people are asking that. Go to Tara's website, go to Barrett's website, go to NRDC, check out what Lindsay's doing at White and Case, read the New York Times article, post it up, Lindsay. Read Nadia's EJ work, right? Get involved. ELI always has pro bono opportunities. They're always out there, and these communities need your support, and they need pro bono attorneys and non-attorneys to step in and facilitate in ways, in many ways. So please do that. Now, I have a question for Tara and Nadia, because there was a lot of overlap in what you were speaking to and how quickly and thoroughly the militarization response when environmental activism starts taking place, and how similar it is to how quickly the system is willing to incarcerate certain communities. Whereas on January 6th, we saw a certain group of white folks march right into the Capitol without any police response whatsoever. I've personally been to a number of environmental protests through the years. Keystone XL pipeline, et cetera, and we've always been faced with very militarized police, regardless of how peaceful we were. So I find that very interesting in the threads from both Nadia and Tara. Tara, you want to start us off and sort of speak to that a little bit?
You mean how it's no big deal if white supremacists overthrow the Capitol, but if we try to protect our own land, that we get thrown in jail and brutalized and maced and tear gassed and all the things.
Pretty much.
Yeah, sure. I would just say that it's a reality that I think most folks don't really know about unless they are paying attention to Ferguson, unless they're paying attention to Standing Rock, unless they're paying attention to Baltimore. The disparate responses to these types of behaviors, which are literally people standing up for their lives, is a completely different response than white supremacists overthrowing the Capitol because Donald Trump's about to lose his job. You know what I mean? There's just they're not even in the same world. Those don't exist in the same world. It should make everyone feel uncomfortable that Native people are charged with trespass on our own land as we're trying to stop a bulldozer from destroying it. That we've said, no, you can't destroy this, and then they do it anyway. That's if we're all gonna play the go down the lawyer path of things, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and everyone seems to be perfectly fine with citing the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, all these different amendments, and everyone is totally fine with the Constitution until we get to the part that says treaties are the supreme law of the land. That is something that this country has never been able to quite grapple with since it started. It doesn't seem to understand that you don't just get to pick and choose which pieces you want to follow through on. And, huge grappling with we the people, who were the people. I think we all know who the people were that signed that document and what they actually intended. But yeah,
Yep. Again, another shout out to tribal sovereignty, and those you lawyers out there. It's very different. Engaging pro bono with Native law is very different than U.S. law, but it is. There are plenty of ways for you to engage pro bono wise and support that effort. Tara, I really appreciate that point. Nadia, do you have anything to say on that? It seems like sort of uncanny the parallels here.
Yeah, I would add in that, if Tara and I had done what the white supremacists did on Capitol Hill, neither of us would be able to live to tell about it. And if we did, we wouldn't be able to go back and resume our lives as if nothing had happened. And so that right there is really emblematic of the problem. And also problematic is that after what happened, there weren't any instances of white racial targeting. There's no surveillance against white communities as a result of that. which is something that both of our communities also have faced as a result of activism and basic work that is done for our rights for our communities. There's this ancient adage by Cicero, who was an ancient Roman philosopher, who said that summum us, summum injuria, which really said that, the more laws, the more injustice there is. And it really inspired a lot of modern conversations about how severe laws have to really be retooled because of the intended as well as unintended consequences that having more laws is going to lead to more injustice and more inequality. And so the more laws we have, the more regulation, the more prisons, the more detentions, and more inhumane conditions that there are, it creates more chaos, uncertainty, and insecurity in communities, and especially in environmental insecurity.
Yeah, I agree completely. And Lindsay and Jeremy, there have been a number of questions about sort of enforcement on Flint. And on one side, I know it's impossible to do in this short period of time, but why is it so hard to pin violators of these things, like Safe Drinking Water Act, et cetera? And then what is happening with the Flint folks? We've heard that former Governor Snyder is now being indicted potentially with criminal charges. Can you give everyone a little update on that?
Yeah, Lindsay, I could talk about the enforcement piece if you want to talk about the kind of update on the criminal side.
Perfect.
So on the enforcement side, which I think I'd mentioned to somebody in one of the comments, was, the issue is, people are allowed to pollute, right? Like that's the problem, right? From the very beginning, we give polluters a permit to pollute to begin with, right? And then the issue with enforcement is a tangle over, did they pollute? How much did they pollute? Did they pollute enough, to get penalized? And when we do penalize them, it's usually negligent, right? It's usually some small amount that becomes a line item in their budget to just write off, as opposed to correcting enforcement, and you just follow a cycle of not taking account for your violations. But yeah, I mean, that's what makes it hard, right? Kind of as I mentioned, the rules and the laws aren't fashioned in a way that allow us to hold polluters accountable in a meaningful way, and that absolutely needs to change.
Yep, and that would be expansion of citizen suits and standing, right? And pushing back on a number of the horrific Supreme Court rulings like Sandoval and Middlesex v. C clamors that have severely limited access to justice and access to remedy under our environmental protection regime.
Yeah, and I think that's that's something that you worked on with Senator Cory Booker a couple years ago on the EJ Act, Scott, right? Like giving those protections to communities and giving that tool to sue back to communities. Yeah.
That's right. Lindsay?
Sure. So recently, charges have finally been brought against former Governor Snyder, as well as the former emergency manager in Flint who made the decision to switch the water source, and other top officials in the government. And of course, this is a welcome development. Finally, people in Flint who have completely and understandably lost trust in their government and in their officials, they can finally get a measure of solace from the fact that there will be accountability, and that there has to be accountability here. One of the most striking moments for me, when we were in the middle of our lawsuit, I was taking a deposition of the highest person at the Michigan Department of Education. She's in charge of special education for the entire state. And I asked her a very simple question, which is, how has life changed for the children of Flint? And her answer was, well, of course it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient to have to drink bottled water. And it affects, I asked, anything else that would have changed for them? And she said, showering, baking, cooking, laundry, those needs. And it was one of those moments where it almost felt like earth-shattering, because there's a total abdication of responsibility. She well understands, she's worked with children with cognitive disabilities for 30 years. She well understands the impact of lead poisoning and that it leads to irreversible brain damage. But yet there's a complete compartmentalization and just pointing a finger at someone else, pushing the blame elsewhere, and no taking of responsibility for helping to ensure the future of these children. And of course, Flint, all of this resulted from the people of Flint being disenfranchised, from democracy being taken away, from their locally elected officials being displaced by the governor who put in charge an emergency manager. And this is what resulted. And this is what you get when you have a government that's put in place to save money and not to safeguard lives, not to safeguard health, and not to safeguard children's futures.
Yeah, and just the consistency of the fact that they've decided that that's a disposable place with disposable people. And so that's already to check box. So now, oh, they need help? No, we've already disposed of that thing. That thing's messed up and we've moved on. We're building a new thing over here now, right? It's an incredible abdication, but it shows you the level of training, the deep systemic training that each one of these personnel at each one of these offices has through what Barrett was speaking about, which is that, if you don't recognize this stuff, if you don't acknowledge that ethnocide is the model around us, you can't possibly begin to cure that. If you don't acknowledge that environmental justice laws are purely procedural and have nothing substantive about them, you can't work to develop substantive EJ laws, right? So we have to get really tangible about what we're working on here. And I really appreciate the fact that everybody on this panel is working so tangibly on the front lines of these efforts, but also recognizing the great ubiquity of these issues. And it's not just Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in America. It's communities all over the world. And I posted a link to a case that I personally work on Chevron's destruction of the Amazon in Ecuador. And for 45 years later, Chevron has not paid a single dollar to these communities that have suffered 77 times worth the pollution that happened in the Deepwater Horizon spill. 77 times worse, and they've gotten $0, right? So the extension, we have to extend our thinking. There's this system, the capitalist system that drives this concept of disposable places and disposable people to extract profit. That system is what needs to be exposed and changed so that we can create a model where equitability is the default rather than profit. So I would also pose to Barrett, what are your thoughts about how we can all begin in our own lives to sort of start moving towards action in this regard?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you know this answer, I think. But the thing is, I think America encourages us to focus on action prior to focusing on the philosophy and the language that creates the clarity for like consistently good action. And so with my work, I focus on the language and the philosophy first. I think if you have the language of ethnocide, next thing you know, your actions that you organically have are going to start asking new questions and bringing up new things and seeing new problems. And I think so the thoughts and the language, because also if you can't speak, if you feel like you're being silenced, whether that's like a group of people, like an entity silencing you, or you just literally don't have the words to say what you see, that's going to impede your actions. And I think a lot of Americans actually have that sentiment. We just don't really acknowledge that we're constantly looking for words to describe stuff that's right in front of our face. And so like my hope, my belief is that the language of ethnocide and the ensuing other words that we can say, like, shameless plug, I have a newsletter called The Word that I give people a new word every week that I think helps give people clarity and language to see and say what what is before them. But that's the action. So, I'm not going to give a specific action that you have to do, but if, people are texting me right now, but like my experience as a Black man growing up in a densely conservative area in the South, I lived on indigenous land, and there was a area right next to it that still had the name of the indigenous land. And there wasn't a language for me as a kid to articulate to the people around me how problematic this was. But I think the language of ethnocide makes it easier for me to articulate this problem, which would then make it easier for me to like collaborate with indigenous people and talk to my friends of many different races who I think mean well, but just don't know how to do things well. And it makes it really easy for me to like concisely articulate what's problematic about stuff that people are doing that they've been told are good. that and tragically just aren't good in any way. And so I think that language and philosophy precedes actions. And once those are sorted, it's a high likelihood that you're going to just do better actions more often than not.
I agree. Beautifully said. And I would reiterate the concept of Ubuntu, which you shared with me as well. And which is the idea that if you exist because I exist, and I exist because you exist. And if we don't get that, then the whole thing is going to fall apart and spaceship Earth is going to crash and burn. So let's figure it out. Go ahead, Barry.
I got to do the Ubuntu one real quick then. So it's a Bantu, like Southern African word, and it actually derives from Bantu, and Bantu means people. And so Ubuntu, the 5-word condensed of this philosophy is I am because we are. And you can see how it's a complete inversion of the European Cartesian way of seeing things, which is I think, therefore I am. And so like, if you think, therefore you are, the thing that determines whether you are or are a person are the random thoughts in your brain. That just doesn't make sense. But with Ubuntu, you are a person because there are other people. So you have to see them as other people, and they have to see you as other people for you to be a person. And this is this philosophy of Ubuntu. Nelson Mandela used it to topple apartheid. Desmond Tutu used it to do the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was after apartheid. And so, you know, there's a need for this type of language, and you know, Ubuntu is really good. It's a pretty short word, and the whole philosophy can be condensed in 5 words. You don't need like 800 pages to understand it, which is really helpful. So yeah. Oh, and also the we with Ubuntu, it like actually can expand beyond people. Like the we is more expansive than like the limited we that the US proposes. So like we can be the trees, we can be the land, because like you get your food from that, you eat it. If it goes in you, it becomes you. Now that's that. And so it's really a really helpful philosophy that has a clear environmental connection, but also a racial justice connection too.
Perfect. That's beautiful. Well, let's wrap with that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this free webinar, which I will note is only free because of our excellent members and our partners. So please join us at the ABA and CRSJ, and please join the efforts at everyone's various groups. They are truly at the front line, incredible folks. And please check back on the webpage. We will have the video of this so you can share it and review it if you missed the beginning or whatever. And best of luck with everything you do. We look forward to hearing from you. And please watch the rest of our series this month, celebrating Black History Month.